Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. I'm Chris Chivvis, the director of the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment, and this is Pivotal States. India is, without a doubt, a pivotal state today and will remain one in the mid-21st century. It's soon to be the world's most populous country. It is a democracy. It is one of China's biggest geopolitical competitors in Asia. And Indian Americans also make up one of the largest and most influential diaspora groups in the United States today. These facts seem to make India a natural ally of the United States. And so it's not surprising that multiple US presidents have tried to strengthen the relationship with New Delhi. The story begins actually at least 20 years ago under President George W. Bush, whose administration negotiated the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement, opening the door to nuclear cooperation between our two countries. Since then, relations with India and Washington seem only to have grown stronger. Under the Trump and especially the Biden administration, the US worked to revive the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, which brings India, Australia, and Japan together with the United States in a league of powerful Asian democracies. The US has also sought to deepen technological cooperation with India, launching the US-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, referred to usually as ICET, earlier this year. India remains a top priority for the Biden administration, as evidenced, of course, by the upcoming visit of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to Washington later this month. But at the same time that relations have strengthened in some ways, India's foreign policy has disappointed and even frustrated US officials in some other key areas. There's been friction over trade and market access, and most of all, frustration over India's close relationship with Russia, a relationship that's remained strong despite Russia's attacks on Ukraine. So what I'm trying to understand today in this conversation is how far US-India relations can go. Can India become a real ally when it comes to competing with China? What should Washington expect from New Delhi? And how much should the Biden administration and future US administrations invest in courting India as a partner in this new era of strategic competition? So with me today to talk about these questions are two of the world's top experts on US-India relations. I have Lisa Curtis, who served as the top official in the White House on US-India relations from 2017 to 2021, and is now a senior fellow and the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. And also my colleague here at the Carnegie Endowment, Ashley Tellis, who was an intellectual force behind the India Civil Nuclear Agreement that I mentioned a minute ago. He's one of the world's leading experts on Indian strategic issues and the author of a controversial new article in Foreign Affairs titled America's Bad Bet on India. I really appreciate both of you being with me here today.
Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here.
Great to be here.
As we talked about before, just before we came online here, I like to start these pivotal states discussions by thinking about US interests. And I think in the case of India, it seems to me that the real question is obviously about what America's interests are, but also about what India's interests are and how India sees them, and the extent to which there is convergence between US interests and Indian interests as we look out over the course of the next decade or so. I think everyone would probably agree that there is at least some convergence between US and India's interests and how they see their interests. But I think there's probably some disagreement about the degree of that convergence. In other words, how much US and India's interests are likely to converge in the coming years. So I would love it if each of you would lay out for me, just sort of big picture, how you see the shape of US and India's interests evolving and the extent to which they are going to continue to converge, stay the way that they are, or potentially even diverge in some important areas. Ashley, since you wrote the article on America's bad bet on India, I'm going to ask you to go first, and then I'll turn to Lisa. So, Ashley, what do you think?
So let me try and outline what I think are American interests in India, and then I'll say a few words about what I think are India's interests in the United States. Uh, I would argue that the U.S. has three core interests in India, and they are each of equal importance. The first is to see India thrive as a vibrant liberal democracy. And that's important because of the exemplary implications of India as a democratic success for the kind of global order that the United States has invested in for a very long time. The second interest that the US has in India is to see India's power grow. And as a result of that growth in power, the deepening of the bilateral partnership. And I think that objective is important because it conduces towards strengthening the multipolar order in Asia, which the US judges to be very important for its own strategic interests, especially vis-a-vis China. And I would say that the third interest that we have in India is in deepened economic ties across the board, so that each country becomes the motor of prosperity for the other. Those are, to my mind, three interests that the United States has had in India, at least since the end of the Cold War. Now, what is India's interests? I think India's interests primarily lie in rising as a great power in its own right. And it sees the United States as a very important ally in that quest. And it sees the US interest in India as being the vehicle through which India can use American resources, whether that is diplomatic resources, economic resources, or military resources, to essentially help India achieve what has been a dream since independence, which is becoming one of the world's great powers. And I see those intersections between Indian interests and American interests as offering quite fruitful opportunities for cooperation for the next several years.
Let me turn to Lisa before I ask you a couple of questions about that. Lisa, how do you see the degree of divergence and convergence between America and India's interests as we look ahead?
Well, I think first, what I would say is you mentioned that the strengthening of the US-India relationship goes back 20 years. I would go back even farther. I would go back 30 years ago in the early 90s, which is really when India embarked on its economic reforms. And I think that is what, got the US attention, the opening of the Indian market, the opportunities, the economic opportunities. And then second, in the mid to late 90s, I think there was a recognition that as India and China were both rising economies, that it was the US and India that really had the common or converging security interests, as well as that bedrock foundation of both being vibrant democracies. And that was really important. The fact that India was a democracy played a significant role in what I would call the US pivot toward India. Of course, it really took off, like you said, during the Bush administration, the early 90s, the early 2000s rather. And, I would quote former US National Security Advisor and former Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, who used to say, the US and India together can help ensure that the balance of power in the region favors freedom. And so that was really a significant fact, India being a democracy. And I would say that these foundational reasons or interests of the US in India have only grown and intensified in the last 15 years, as we've seen China enhance its military capabilities. enhance its global economic footprint, as well as become more assertive with its foreign policy ambitions, and seeking to enhance its maritime and territorial claims. So I think what we see now is the U.S. interest in India have only grown. And in fact, I would say that the Biden administration believes that a strong U.S.-India partnership is essential to achieving its Indo-Pacific goals. I think this idea that India forms an integral part of maintaining a free, open, prosperous, resilient Indo-Pacific region has become even more important in the last few years. And I think it's because of this, because India is so essential to U.S. goals in the Indo-Pacific region, that this administration has been willing to overlook some of India's more unhelpful policies toward Russia. Because let's face it, there are major divergences between the U.S. and India over Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
I definitely want to get to that, and I know, Lisa, that you've written about that. So I have some things that I want to touch on there. But let's stick with interest here for 1 minute. Lisa, you certainly mentioned China and the attention that has been placed on China here in Washington over the course of the last few years. Ashley, you may have mentioned it in passing, but in your depiction of India's interest in the relationship with the United States, it had more to do with strengthening India than with containing or balancing China. Now, to some degree, it was perhaps implicit in what you said, but I wonder if there's maybe a little bit of a divergence there between how the United States sees the rationale for deepening this relationship and how it's seen from New Delhi. Because obviously here in the United States, we see India very much through the lens of China and the Indo-Pacific. But is that also the case in India? And if not, what's the implication for how we ought to approach India?
So I think there is a convergence in terms of objectives. Both the United States and India share the objective of not having an Asia that is dominated by China, or an Indo-Pacific region which is subject to Chinese coercion and Chinese assertiveness. I think that is a very clear point of convergence between both Washington and New Delhi. But the instruments that both sides emphasize are not always identical. And I think that is partly because of geography, it is partly because of relative power, and it is partly because of the location of the two countries in the international system. And let me speak to each of those sort of quickly, right? The United States is a hegemonic power in Asia. It has obligations to treaty allies, which it has to uphold. And it has to uphold whether or not India will support us in that activity. So that is one area where there is a potential for divergence, because the US has obligations that India does not. The second is that India is located uncomfortably close to China, and therefore does not have the latitude to pursue, what I would think of as, say, a pugnacious foreign policy towards China, which the United States has, because the United States is farther away from China than India is. And third, the relative balances of power favor the United States. They don't favor India in exactly the same way. The US, for all of China's rise, is still the more powerful country. And it has many more instruments with which to confront China than India does. India is the weaker country relative to China. And so India has to be a lot more nuanced and a lot more subtle in the way that it addresses the China challenge compared to the United States. In other words, we have the luxury of distance, we have the luxury of capacities, and we have the luxury of just overwhelming power. On all three counts, India is quite different from us. And so the tools that India would use to balance China will, of necessity, be a lot more subtle than the tools that the US would use, even though the objectives of making certain that China cannot, overwhelm the Indo-Pacific, I think, remain in common for both countries.
So you wrote, Ashley, in your recent article, if I remember correctly, that some in the United States may be harboring illusions about what to expect from New Delhi. So can you just, in concrete terms, explain what that means? I mean, what is it that you've made it clear that there is a role for India to play in the future of U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, but what are the illusions that could potentially lead us astray?
Well, the illusions, I don't want to use that word because I didn't use it. But
okay, so
my concern is that as the relationship deepens, and the relationship has been deepening as, both you and Lisa affirmed over the last several decades, my concern is that we not have exaggerated expectations.
Okay.
And the key point there is that no matter how deep our partnership gets, there will be some thresholds that I think India is unlikely to cross. And to me, the biggest threshold that India is likely to avoid is essentially the threshold of military participation in coalition operations that may be necessary against China in the event of a contingency like a war in Taiwan or a conflict in the East China Sea or a conflict in the South China Sea. I think that is a bridge that India will likely not cross unless it is threatened directly by China itself. And so to that degree, no matter how close our relationship becomes, it will not be a relationship of the sort that breeds the expectations that we currently have, say, for example, with Australia or with Japan. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a point that is worth appreciating, that, India is going to be different. And it should not cause us any problems as long as we recognize that that is the limit of the relationship with India.
Lisa, do you see it in the same terms? Would you see the same limits on the relationship, or would you place the limits further out, or maybe even closer in?
Well, no, I agree with Ashley completely that the U.S. should not hold out any hope that in the event there was some potential future contingency in the Taiwan Strait or something in the South China Sea or East China Sea, that India would support the United States through military means, or by sending warships or doing anything really in the military space. I have to agree with Ashley on that. But I don't see that U.S. officials actually are expecting that of India. The way I see it is that the U.S. is choosing to invest in India, to increase its defense cooperation, consider even co-production of jet engine technology, which is really a huge deal. Only a handful of countries have that ability to produce jet engines. So this would be a major step forward. And it sounds like things are getting in place for such an announcement here when Prime Minister Modi is in town. But I think that really there's two aims with that. And, one is obviously to try to wean India away from its dependence on Russian technology and defense cooperation. And the second is so that India can build up its own capabilities to protect itself from Chinese aggression. So I think these are important nuances. So on the one hand, I agree with Ashley on the limits of what India might do in the future, and if there is a contingency in the Taiwan Strait or some kind of conflict between the U.S. and China. But at the same time, I don't think that's the purpose of the current tremendous investment that we're seeing the U.S. make in India.
And I want to get to talking about that investment a little bit more, but let's talk about one other limit, which you've already raised, which is India's relationship with Russia. You wrote about a year ago that India would have to choose after the war in Ukraine, that it really had to decide whether it was going to lean strongly towards Moscow or towards Washington. A year later, that still hasn't happened. So my question to you is, have the circumstances changed, or is it just a matter of time that it's inevitable that India will have to choose? How do you see it now?
Yeah, I don't think I said that India would have to choose. I think I probably said India should choose, and
Okay.
India should choose the West. That was its best bet in terms of protecting its own future national security interests. And I said that because a couple of reasons. One is that what Russia has done in Europe by invading a sovereign country, trying to use its military might to coerce this sovereign country, that undermines the entire concept of territorial sovereignty throughout the world and including in Asia. And, that doesn't help in terms of what China may contemplate in the future. And so if we ever see a situation where China, further encroaches into Indian territory on their disputed border, or even, conducts an invasion, India will want international support for the concept of territorial sovereignty and, protecting your own territory. And, it might not get that support since it is not stepping up and really defending Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. So I think that's one point. And the other point is because we are seeing this Russia-China enhanced relationship, we see the no limits partnership that was announced, just days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It really demonstrates that India may not be able to always count on Russia and its support. And so it really is undermining its strategic options by, thinking it can continue to rely on Russia or can, actually create this wedge between Russia and China. I think that, that is what India is trying to do. Whatever means possible, however it can do it, it wants to try to keep a wedge between Russia and China because it doesn't want to contemplate the idea of a Russia and China arrayed against it, and then you throw Pakistan in there and things look really dire from the Indian perspective. So I understand what India is doing and why it's doing it. I just don't think it makes sense over the long term. I think it makes more sense for India to, gradually shift away from Russia, become more not dependent, but become less dependent on Russia for its military equipment, however it wants to do that, if it wants to produce within its own borders or rely on an array of other more dependable partners. But it really doesn't make sense for it to continue its strong dependence on Russian military equipment, particularly when Russia is going to be more dependent on China and more isolated from the West moving forward.
Very interesting. This is Pivotal States with the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment. I'm Chris Chivvis, and I'm here with two of the world's leading experts on U.S.-India relations, my colleague Ashley Tellis and Lisa Curtis. We're talking about all parts of the U.S.-India relationship, and we're going to go to questions from the audience in about 5 minutes or so. But I want to stay on this topic of Russia, Ashley, and get your thoughts about it. Do you think that over time India will come to see the same challenges that Lisa just laid out very clearly for us in its relationship with Russia, and as a consequence, attenuate that relationship in favor of a closer defense relationship with Washington?
I don't see India moving away from Russia in any substantive sense. I think Lisa is absolutely right that they ought to be concerned about the rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing. They ought to be concerned about a weakening Russia and the increased dependence that Russia will have on China and the implications of that dependence for Indian security. But at the end of the day, I think Indian policymakers seem to attribute to Russia a much greater resilience than we do in the West. And they appear to have a measure of confidence that no matter how close Russia appears to be to China currently, there will be enough space in the relationship between Moscow and Beijing to give India the maneuvering room that it desires with respect to Russia. But there's something I think that is more fundamental that often gets lost in the discussion about dependency. And that is India values Russia as an important part of the multipolar global system that it wants to see emerge. And it is threatened by the loss of Russia as a potential pole. And because India values that multipolar system, which is not anywhere on the horizon, but because it wants to preserve the possibility of that multipolar system, I think the Indians will do everything they can to keep the Russians in play as a pole. And at the very least, what that means is not walking away from the Russians, either at this point or at any other point in the future. And so I think they are aware about the challenges that they face, including the risks of an excessive dependency on Russia for arms, which is what explains the investments they're making in diversification toward other partners. But at the end of the day, there is a fundamental reality that they cannot escape, which is if they really desire a multipolar world, then Russia will have to be one of those poles in that world. And they will want to protect their relationship with Russia precisely because they think there is a good chance that one day that multipolar world will come about. So I don't see the Indians getting ready to sacrifice their relationship with Russia anytime soon. And I think that is a calculation that goes beyond arms dependency.
It's fascinating that you bring in their preference for world order into the picture here, because we do, of course, focus on energy and the defense relationship usually when we think about the nature of India's relationship with Russia. But let me ask you both. I mean, so if the Indian relationship with Russia is going to continue on some level to be at least meaningful, if not strong, how should the United States take that into account in its policy? I mean, obviously, we are at a moment of extreme tension with Russia right now in Europe and around the world. How much should India's relationship with Russia matter in the bilateral relationship? Lisa?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we don't talk about much is the example that India is setting for other Indo-Pacific nations with its stance. It's really able to have its cake and eat it too, because, there is a very divergent position between the US and India on this issue. Yet, as I said, we're going to see probably a very successful state-level visit by Prime Minister Modi, new initiatives announced, including possibly the co-production of jet engine technology. Things are moving forward despite this major difference between the U.S. And India. And, the U.S. does need to have a coalition of support if we're going to maintain a rules-based order, based on openness, territorial sovereignty, free trade, et cetera, promoting democracy, good governance. I think that it does, hurt the U.S. ability to do that when such a major influential country as India is on another side. So I think we have to acknowledge that there is a cost to U.S. Overall strategy when you have this kind of divergent stance by such an important and influential player. And I think about Singapore, who very quickly came out and said that this was wrong, what Russia did, condemned them, joined the sanctions very early on. Singapore takes very independent stances. But I think in this case, being a very small country, they realized the implications for Singapore. And that contributed to their strong stance on the issue. But it did set a good example. It set a good example for the rest of the ASEAN nations. So I think we have to acknowledge that there is a sort of broader cost than just the U.S.-India relationship. There is a cost in the example that it is setting for other nations.
Ashley, what do you think? Do you think that the United States should consider repercussions in its relationship with India because of India's relationship with Russia? Or do you think that simply the need to strengthen multipolarity in the Indo-Pacific is so great right now that we have to prioritize the U.S.-India relationship, despite the fact that it remains close with Russia?
So I share Lisa's view on this completely, that the demonstration effects of India's choices have reverberations that go way beyond the US-India relationship. Having said that, however, I think at least this administration appears to have absorbed the costs of India's choices. And whether we like it or not, they have in effect decided that the importance of maintaining this Asian multipolarity is so important that no matter how discomforting India's choices on Ukraine are, these are choices that we will simply live with. I know it doesn't make us feel.
No, as our colleague Aaron David Miller often likes to say, governing is about choosing, and so these are difficult realities that we have to face. And so I appreciate both of your candor on that. I want to turn to some of the questions that we have coming in here, and one of the ones that just came in actually is related to what we've been discussing, and that is, to what extent can India, help the United States as a representative or as a voice in the not what used to be called the non-aligned world, what is sometimes now referred to as the global South. Sometimes the United States, either because of a lack of effort or lack of bandwidth, or for other reasons, struggles to make its case in countries from Africa to the Middle East to Latin America even. Does India have a role to play in promoting interests that the United States and India share in these countries? Lisa, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Everything I just said about Russia is there, but there are so many ways that India, does set a good example and can be a good leader. It is a democracy. It is, pushing for standards on technology development, working with the U.S. on critical and emerging technologies. We certainly want India to have influence in this area, and we would certainly prefer that India have influence, to counter some of the Chinese influence, frankly. And I think we see, at least in Southeast Asia, that the countries want India to be more present, to be more involved. They want choices. So they're all too happy to welcome India's presence, economic, political, even military in some cases, in terms of exporting defense technology, et cetera. So I think that, certainly the U.S. wants India to have a strong role looking east, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, and India, is a vibrant democracy. It's, has huge economic potential. We want to see more of the supply chains for critical minerals, technology, and other items going through India. So I do think that the U.S. Looks to India to take that leadership role and has been very supportive of India's presidency of the G20. So yeah, I think, Ashley's right. You sort of have to put aside the Russia issue, and look at things more holistically, in all their different perspectives, and recognize that India has a very important role to play in the what's often called the global South. And I think of Southeast Asia in particular.
That's very helpful. I want to talk some about technology and the new technology initiative that the United States and India have undertaken as of this year, and get your thoughts on that. But let's do at least one more of the questions that we have here. We have a number of good questions from the audience. One of them is sort of asking, and this may lead us to talk about technology, about the extent to which the United States is going to be capable of providing trade concessions to India. This is a big challenge right now because of the way that U.S. domestic politics has evolved over the last few years. It's very difficult for U.S. administrations, Democrat or Republican, to seriously consider offering meaningful market access to a number of countries that would like to have it. And this is seen, I think, across many countries in the world as something that potentially weakens U.S. influence. Do you see a scenario for India, at least, where maybe not tomorrow, but say in 5 years or so, the United States might be able to offer meaningful market access to expand the access that already exists in ways that would further add economic ballast to the bilateral relationship? Ashley, what do you think?
Well, I think this is going to be a challenge for precisely the reasons that you flagged, Chris. I mean, we are at a point in our domestic politics where we have two political parties that have, mysteriously turned out to be both anti-trade. So there is no appetite in the United States for trade expansion with very many countries, and some of that includes our friends. So I don't imagine that we will be able to make any trade breakthroughs in a hurry. During the Trump administration, we had seen the US government actually putting a lot of capital in trying to resolve the outstanding trade disputes that we had with India. I mean, trade disputes that actually go back 20 years. These are not new. Today, this administration has paid virtually no attention to resolving those trade disputes, because everything that USTR is doing these days is anything but market access. The biggest issue that we have today with respect to India right now is the status of GSP, the so-called generalized schedule of preferences, which were taken away from India during the last years of the Trump administration, and which India is seeking to be reinstated. But that is dependent on congressional action and the reauthorization of GSP preferences sort of worldwide. And again, I don't see an appetite in Congress right now for reauthorizing those preferences. And until that happens, I think we are going to be sort of locked into some sort of into a standoff. But thankfully, because we have an administration in Washington that doesn't care too much about trade, and we have an administration in New Delhi that is not eager to make trade breakthroughs either, the standoff is not costing us anything politically. And so, this is a status quo that we can live with, and we will probably live with for a while. So unless the Biden administration changes course, if there is a second term, I don't see trade issues as becoming central or deeply problematic to the relationship, as they were, for example, during the second Obama term, where we spilt a lot of blood with respect to market access issues in India.
And I guess that's why the administration has looked to technology as a potential substitute or alternative for deepening the relationship to trade. Lisa, you've already raised it. Can you talk a little bit more about the extent to which you think cooperation on technology can provide that balance, especially in the absence of further concessions from either side on trade?
Yeah, I think the technology issues have become so critically important as we see China making advancements. We're all hearing about China's advancements with AI. There's a lot of concern that it's moving so quickly. And the other issue here is the applications of this emerging technology to defense systems. So that's really catalyzing greater cooperation between the U.S. and India to see, how the two sides can work together, and how they're looking at the issues of development and deployment of these technologies, standards. And that's really what we're seeing with the initiative on critical and emerging technologies that was announced a year ago, and had very productive meetings between the two countries' national security advisors in January of this year. And of course, U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is going to India next week and will, take that conversation even further. So, you really get into the nitty-gritty of, some of the access that India will have to U.S. technology, what it means for advanced capabilities, undersea capabilities. There is a new impetus to these discussions, which I think have always been important, especially to India. But I think now with seeing how much China is advancing, the U.S. now understands that importance of really cooperating closely with India and, trying to take advantage of the strengths on both sides, and in terms of research, skill training, manpower that India has, and the engineering capabilities. And there, are so many ways that the two sides can benefit from this increased technology cooperation, not to mention the progress that has been made on semiconductors in particular. This has been a real area of focus for India and the United States. And I see that only growing as we move into the future.
Ashley, do you agree? Do you think that this is an area that can really provide a cornerstone, could become a cornerstone of the U.S.-India relationship, or is it too soon to tell?
Well, I certainly think that it's an area of enormous potential because there are vast complementarities between the two countries. India has a huge pool of very skilled labor. US companies are already beginning to tap into those skills in terms of R&D establishments that we have established in India in order to support American industry. So that is already happening. But I think the jury is still going to be out on whether the government-led initiatives will deliver in the manner intended. And I think that is partly because we have so many areas that we are now looking at that I suspect the end results are likely to be spottier than we would like to see, because we are talking of so many areas of high technology that I can't imagine that we would have uniform successes in each of these areas. But that, of course, doesn't mean that we ought to, stop trying. We obviously ought to try. And I think the ISET initiative offers, a new window to doing things that we have not explored before, especially in the area of startups, which is entirely new terrain. My big concern is less the ISET program or even government initiatives.
Okay.
I would like to see the two economies essentially open up to each other much more, so that these alliances across national borders arise organically without governments having to constantly midwife the effort. I mean, when we look at, for example, technical collaboration with our allies like Japan or Germany or the Netherlands, you don't see the United States government having to step in at every step of the way in order to forge what are commercial alliances. I mean, that seems to be a unique feature of the US-India relationship. And I think there is something unnatural about it. I mean, I want to see a day come by where business entities in both countries will make deals across national borders without governments even knowing. And I think the fact that government has to inject itself at every step of the way, to my mind, is indicative still of the immaturity of our economic engagement, rather than any sort of success that we've achieved so far. I mean, I share Lisa's enthusiasm for the things that we're trying to do, but our achievements so far have been largely at the level of process. Now, we just have to hope that these process-related innovations, will yield actual successes. But, let's give it time. I mean, this has just been a year, and hopefully, in the months and years to come, we will see the fruits of what this administration has begun.
Can I just add that I'm really happy that the dialogue, the ISET dialogue, is being carried out by the respective national security councils. And, in the United States, the different government agencies, are convened by the NSC. And this is what it takes, because you've got, particularly in India, where you have so many ministries that are dealing with these issues, but you really need that sort of centralization that I think the national security councils can provide, and kind of give that, top-down direction to the ministries, and bring the dialogues together, so that you don't have these stovepipes. And I think that's what we have seen in the past, and I think that's how ISET will be different than some of the other technologies dialogues that we've had between the US and India, like the High Technology Cooperation Group, and other initiatives. I think that's very important that it's between the national security advisors, that they're the ones really driving the dialogue.
That's very interesting and insightful. This is Pivotal States with the American Statecraft Program here at the Carnegie Endowment. We're talking about the future of U.S.-India relations. I've got Ashley Tellis, my colleague here, and Lisa Curtis. I want to ask a couple of questions from the audience here. We have a couple of ones that touch on the UN Security Council. This is obviously a really important issue for India, for the UN, and also for the U.S.-India relationship. It's been a difficult one. Lisa, I wonder if you would be willing to sort of provide your views on the outlook, the prospects for India and membership on the Security Council, and especially, how much can and should the United States push for that?
Well, this issue has been out there for so long. I remember, I think it was when President Obama went to India, this is over 10 years ago now. And, there was so much debate within the US system. Should he support, India's membership on the UN Security Council? And of course he did. He came out very strongly and supported that. And, every US administration since has had the same policy. But the problem is that that the idea of reforming the Security Council is seems so far away. It's just something that I don't see happening in the near term. And let's face it, right now the Security Council is not that effective. There's been very little on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so I'm not sure, how effective the UN Security Council has been of late on the major issues that are happening around the globe. So whereas I think, the idea of India as part of an expanded UN Security Council is a good idea. I just think the realities of how the organization operates and how slow things are to change, that it's something that's likely not to happen anytime soon.
Ashley, what do you think? Should the United States push harder on this issue?
Well, our commitment to supporting India is a post-dated check. I don't think any reform of the Security Council is imminent. And unless we can figure out first what the structure of a reformed Security Council looks like, I think the question of how much energy and political capital we want to expend with respect to support for specific members, I think that is an issue that comes only down the line. I agree with Lisa completely. This is not imminent, and this is something that we will all be waiting for a very long time to come. And I would make one other point somewhat cynically, and that is, an expanded UN Security Council may be a council that the US has even less time for, because given the problems we already have with the Security Council as it is, having an enlarged Security Council will probably tax, our ability to achieve our interests all the more.
Let me ask you both to just step back for a minute. You both have served in the White House at different times during your careers. If you were to sit down again next week with President Biden and talk about U.S.-India relations, what would be at the top of your list to address? What priorities would you try to emphasize? What would you insist that the United States do right now? Lisa?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would, advise that the U.S. invest heavily in the India relationship, pull out, all stops with regard to technology sharing, partnering with India in the Indo-Pacific, investing in the Quad, as you mentioned before. I was in the Trump administration when the Quad was revived. Very proud, that has happened, and in fact, the Biden administration has taken the Quad to the next level. Certainly, continue to invest in the Quad relationship. So I think that the point is that India and the U.S. interests on managing the challenge of a rising China are really quite similar, and that there's a lot to be gained by partnering with India in dealing with this challenge. And so I think maybe there's a small risk that the U.S. makes all of this investment and India doesn't feel any compulsion to support the U.S. or its allies, and does not contribute to this idea of a sort of networked security architecture. But I think the probability of that happening is very, very low. I think the more likely scenario is that India will contribute to a free, open, resilient region, particularly in the diplomatic, political, economic space, maybe a little less so militarily, but I think having India's overall influence in this region is extremely important, and really serves U.S. national security interests. So I think that would be my advice. And just secondly, on the issue of human rights, protection of minority rights, I would advise that the president raise these issues with Prime Minister Modi behind closed doors. Certainly there is concern about the treatment of religious minorities, particularly during the second term of the Modi government. I don't think this is anything that should raise alarm bells. It's not something that it's more subtle. It's something that's happening very subtly. this movement away from the value of a secular, multi-religious, multi-ethnic democracy. You sort of see India moving slightly away from that under this BJP government. But I think India remains a vibrant democracy. India holds regular elections. The democratic institutions are intact. But I think it's worth the president quietly, just discussing some of these issues with Prime Minister Modi, but behind closed doors. It doesn't merit any sort of public condemnation of India, and certainly not with some of the challenges we've seen in our own democracy of late.
Very interesting and insightful comments, Lisa. Thank you. Ashley, if you were to sit down with President Biden in the Oval Office next week, what would be at the top of your agenda?
Well, pretty much things that are similar to what Lisa articulated, which is publicly we want to do everything we can to signal to India that we value the partnership, that partnership is extremely important for our core national interests and hopefully India's core national interests as well. And that partnership has many dimensions and takes many forms. And I think the administration will do just that. That is both in symbols and in substance. It will communicate that India is a valued partner of the United States. And then whatever the discordant notes are, those discordant notes have to be handled with a certain delicacy behind closed doors. And I think the administration will do that as well. And that, to my mind, is the best you can do in the circumstances. I will also say that I suspect the president will go out of his way to be personally reassuring towards the prime minister, because I think he values the personal relationship with the prime minister. And he will find ways of emphasizing that personal relationship. And in the past, the relationships between leaders has had very high payoffs for both sides. And so I expect that this visit will be a continuation of that. And I hope he does that.
This has been a really strategic discussion with both of you. You've made points that have sparked all kinds of thoughts, and I could probably go on asking you questions for the rest of the afternoon here in Washington. But I think we have to bring it to a close, unfortunately. Thank you so much, both of you, for doing this. It's been really fun to talk to you. I've learned a ton, and look forward to continuing this conversation later.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you.